Welcome in, everybody. We're just gonna wait a couple of minutes while everybody filters in. Good morning, Myisha. Um, oh, I can't hear you. You're on
Good
mute. Oh, there
morning.
you go. Good morning. So, Myisha and I were just saying, I am in Denver. This is not for those of you who watch regularly, this is not my regular place. I'm in Denver to see a health specialist. So, this is my background. And Myisha, where are you?
I'm in Oakland, but I'm moving, so I'm also in a different space. So this is my virtual background.
Oh, wait, you're moving? Are you moving? Is it like a
Yes,
big move or a,
it's a
you
big
know?
move. I'm going to a different state, so
Oh, that's a big move.
it's a big
Wow,
move.
okay.
During the pandemic, it's fun.
Yeah, and doing everything you're doing with your book. That's um
Yes,
that's that's a good amount on your plate.
yes, but I'm glad I have a
Yeah.
support system to help me kind of
Totally
get it done.
gotta have it. Yeah, yeah, totally gotta have that. Where
Yeah,
when are you in the process of moving right now?
yeah. So I move Sunday. I'm moving Sunday night.
Okay, okay, got it. Yeah. So you're in the throes of it. Yeah,
Yeah.
we moved only a mile up the street, but we moved right before the pandemic started in New York.
Oh
So we
wow.
moved February 27th. And then well I actually got sick March 8th. I got COVID March 8th.
Oh no.
And yeah, I'm fine. But luckily, but yeah, so we just like threw everything in our house and we're still actually unpacking because you know
Yeah.
what I mean? Like we got sick and then we were like, well, it's mostly okay. So we're just, now we still are like picking out boxes. So
Absolutely.
it's such an
Oh
interesting
man.
time.
It is.
Yeah,
It's an interesting time we're living in. I mean, oh my gosh, who would have thought?
yeah, it sure
I
is. It definitely is.
My friends and I joke. We're like, well, our generation, we saw the Persian Gulf War, we saw the Twin Towers, we saw economic spiral. Like we were naming everything we've lived through as millennials, or the older end of the millennials. And it's definitely, and now global pandemic. This is definitely a trying time.
Yeah, I think there's like a lot of uncertainty for everybody, It's just how do you plan and
Yeah.
manage and all that. And I have lots of friends who are moving and things like that right now. All right, looks like we're pretty good. I'm going to take a sip of water and then we're going to get started, everybody. Thank you so
Okay.
much, everybody, for being here. Mm, so, all right. Thank you for joining and welcome to Lead Dev Bookmarked. Lead Dev is a global community of engineering leaders who come together to discuss all things leadership, teams, tools, and tech. Bookmarked is our monthly book club, and this is our 7th event. If you have questions, please put them into the Zoom chat. I'm Susan Bond, and I'll be your moderator for this discussion. I'm a former COO of a scaling startup and an executive coach. My specialty is tech leaders. You can find me on Twitter at Susan Bond. Today, we'll be talking about Check Your Privilege with Myisha T. Hill. Myisha T. Hill is an awesome and sometimes exhausted mother to 3 different abled yet brilliant children. She is an anti-racism guide, mental health activist, speaker, and entrepreneur who is passionate about women's mental wellness and empowerment. As a passionate advocate for mental wellness, Myisha T. Hill believes that when people get real, they begin to heal. I love this, by the way. Like such a great anyway. She founded she founded the Check Your Privilege movement, an online community and a series of workshops that support women all over the world in exploring their relationships with power, privilege, and racism. Also a proponent for women of color having access to healing, she co-leads Brown Sisters Speak, a mental health peer support and women's empowerment movement for Black, Brown, Indigenous women of color. Welcome so much. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be here. It's an honor, as always.
Yeah, it's so great. So, Check Your Privilege is part of an anthology series. Can you tell us a little
Mhm.
bit about the background, like how the series came about?
Absolutely. So the whole idea of check your privilege came from experiencing harm from a friend, and so through my own inner work around anti-blackness and coaching and therapy, it was part of my like plan of empowerment for myself and others to take their journey of becoming actively anti-racist and create shared storytelling. Because as I said before, when people get real, they begin to heal. And so a lot of the
Mm,
books that are written for anti-racism or around like the systems of domination are really kind of big intellectualized pieces of work that are necessary. But for me, it was a plan to create a series so that people can drop down and connect and see themselves in somebody else's story. Because storytelling does change lives. And
Yeah.
the idea of the anthology was when I grew up, there was a series called Chicken Soup for the Soul. So we kind of laugh and we're like, this is a
Read
series called
it.
Chicken Soup for the Soul for anti-racists. And so every part of this anthology series is different authors, different stories, and different themes to help empower folks on their anti-racism journey.
That's so good. And this is the first book in the series.
Yeah, so Live into the Work is the first book of the series.
Oh, Live into the Work is the first book. This is the second book.
Um, the second book is Lean into Discomfort. That one comes out next month.
Oh, that's right. Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that comes out next month. Yeah. I'm like trying to, series are always like tricky. I'm like, which one came first, even in
hmm
books. So, can you tell us a little bit about how you structured the series and why this book, why you picked this one for, first?
yeah, so with the publisher, Nicole over at Dirt Path Publishing, the idea was to tell a thorough line of stories that connect, right? So, what is the first story that opens up the conversation? It's like the beginner's guide to
Mm,
really doing this work. And it was, at first, we were like, well, it's lean into the discomfort. And I'm like, no, that's not the first step. The first step is the awakening. And so, whenever you awaken to a new journey, you have to take the first step to live into the new journey, right? It's like
mm,
in the Alchemist or the hero's journey, you make a decision to step in and just go with it and live with whatever comes, even with the challenges. And so the first book was kind of like that baby step into, well, what am I supposed to do in the process? And how do I really live into the experience of this anti racism journey? And it was also the
mm,
notion that so many of us as educators were telling people to do the work, do your work, do your work. And doing for me upholds white supremacy because it's be productive, which is great. But when you're not living into it, you're not experiencing the fullness of the journey. You're not
mm,
experiencing the challenge. When the challenges come, you ghost. When the challenges come, you okay, I'm done, I'm finished. I read this book, now I can keep going. But when you really live it, you embody the idea and the belief of actually engaging your full self in your life on the journey forward. So we chose that book for that specific reason.
yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna, I was thinking about like, it's like in the first book, it shares the stories of, five different women, and it seems a really conscious choice. And it made me curious, like, why would did you want to share their stories rather than just yours?
Um, I'm going to just be frank. A lot of the books that I've read shared the one person narrative. And
Mm,
I really, my strength finders, my number one is connection. And so, because I know through another project that I've worked with, The Power of Human Connection, I wanted this series to not just be about me. Like, I have a book in the works about me and my journey in life, but I really wanted something to show connection across racial difference. That's
mm,
what's missing, is that the thorough line of all of our stories, there's an interconnection. Because if I talk about anti-blackness, white women are talking about anti-blackness, Latino women are talking about anti-blackness, etc. And so I could have made it about me, but the nature of who I am as a person and the idea of connecting with a thorough line of different voices, different experiences, different class stances, it was
mm.
key to hit different areas of folks around the world globally.
Mm. Yeah, it was very clear to me that there was a conscious choice, and I wanted to hear that background. By the way, I'm a
Yeah.
certified strengths coach, and I love connectedness. That's not mine. I'm a strategic is my number one. But
Yeah.
I love that you mentioned that. Strengths Finder, by the way, for everybody, is a really incredible talent assessment. It's not a personality assessment; it's a talent assessment. But that's not what this is about. But just for
Not at
people who don't
all.
know,
Yeah, yeah,
Strengths
yeah.
Finder is just a great thing that you can check out at some point. But I love that background because I actually got that as a reader. I each person's journey was so interesting to me, and it helped me see things from a different lens. But there was that through line. So let's talk about some of their stories.
Okay.
So like one of the things that stood out for me about Brittany's story was realizing that she wasn't doing the inner work specifically around owning her own white privilege. Can you define that term in case someone isn't familiar with the term white privilege?
Yes. There are so many definitions when we think of privilege. So, privilege, in essence, um, is the unearned access to resources or social power
Mm,
that's readily available to some people because of their social group, their advantage. And basically, when we talk about white privilege, it's the unearned access to social power because of them being associated with the dominant culture or white culture.
mm,
And it's given to white people oftentimes at the expense of people of color.
mm. Thank you so much. I want to make sure we're all talking the same language here and we have a good understanding. Because I wanted to talk a little bit more about Brittany because her story was so interesting. She talks about ghosting her anti-racism work, and
Yeah.
and she talked about it as a form of white privilege. So I think we're all familiar with ghosting, but this was the first time I'd heard it in that context. So, and I was like, oh, this is so interesting and so cool. Can you tell us, can you speak a little bit more about what Brittany meant by that and how it was a turning point for her for people who haven't read the book yet?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Brittany and I are friends. Most of the folks in the books are my friends. And it came from a dating term. So, we were actually in a workshop. I was teaching a workshop, Brittany was there. And then I just started to say, when we do this work across racial lines, it feels like white folks are ghosting, which is a dating term that's used to describe when all communication cease with a partner or someone you're interested in without warning, without justification,
Yep.
without a willing to communicate. And so she saw that, and we were talking, we had deeper conversations, and she was just like, I'm actually ghosting this process, Myisha. I'm actually not living into this work. I'm actually like, I'm here, but then when I leave your workshop, I'm just like, okay, cool, I'm done. I did it. And even in conversation, she started to notice that has a sense of aversion and avoiding because it's just not a comfortable conversation. And so when we talk about ghosting, we can talk about how, when the conversations around race, power, and privilege come up, folks want to jump on the bandwagon, they want to jump into it. They're excited about it. But as soon as there's something that comes up for them, a moment
Mm,
of discomfort, a moment of when it's just too heavy, there's this process where they just ghost, where they just disappear from the work, where they don't want to do it and lean in back into their privilege because you're so used to having that sense of social power that the
mm,
idea of relinquishing it and really leaning into that is uncomfortable. So when we think about ghosting, we can look at the way that it's used in the dating world and apply it to the work that we do as individuals and collective partners in the work for racial and social justice.
mm. Yeah, that right away I thought, oh, that is so such an apt way to describe it. I love that connection between those
Yeah.
two. I want to talk about a different story now, which Brandy identifies as Black, embracing it unapologetically.
Hmm.
And in her chapter, she talks about defining Blackness in predominantly white spaces. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the importance of self-identity in this context.
Oh, absolutely. In a world that's rooted in inherent anti-blackness, it is so important that when we are Black women in white spaces, that we are able to honor our own humanity and autonomy. And we can be real. We can look at what happened during the debate last night, the
Mm.
ways
I
in
didn't.
which,
I didn't. I didn't watch it. Yeah. So
okay,
I
well,
don't. I don't know. Yeah.
that's okay. The ways in which Kamala Harris she was very poised and very,
Mm,
she was just her full self. She wasn't taking any no chaser, like to the point, in her power, in her full self. And oftentimes, Black women who position themselves in the same way are often looked down upon, or seen as a threat,
mm,
or there's this idea of the angry Black woman stereotype. But what I appreciate about Brandy's story is she's, despite anti-Blackness, despite what my colleagues may think of me, whether and her story says, whether her colleagues are Black or white, she is
yep.
going to stand up and step into her Black womanhood unapologetically, whether it makes you comfortable or not. We live in a world that wants us as Black women to deny our humanity, deny our Blackness, and shrink down so that we can fit in a culture of work that is highly toxic, not just for white women, but it's disproportionately toxic for women of color, and in particularly Black women. And so what I appreciated about Brandy's chapter is that she names, my culture is powerful. My culture is beautiful. I am going to be me regardless of who's in the room. I will not shrink down and minimize who I am at the expense of my own mental health to ease white comfort. That's what I loved about Brandy's story.
Yeah, me too. When you talk about that, it makes me I guess I got a new meaning of it too, like centering her comfort with herself and her identity over like my guess is that if you're trying to be in white spaces, centering having to center other people's comfort, and that
Right.
she is centering herself, which is incredibly powerful to me. It seems
Yeah,
like a great self way of self-care and nurturance.
absolutely.
Mm,
It's a powerful way to do that in a space where you're not necessarily even really truly wanted. If you cannot
yeah.
assimilate, oftentimes in corporate spaces, there's really no desire there. You're just a body filling a position or a role.
Hmm. Yeah, her story really stood out in that way. Um, so let's talk about another. We're going to keep jumping through people here, everybody.
Yeah.
Because there's so many great. I feel like every point had a different one. Um, I think those are sirens on my background. I apologize. Um, in talking about her journey to being anti racist, Jennifer says, when I first started, I made the common mistake of focusing on what I could go out and do to fix things. But I have learned that the most important work came once I focused on myself. I think a lot of us might have this belief. We
Right.
might think that the difference, to make a difference, we should focus on changing things in the external environment. So this insight might be surprising. Why is this inner work so essential?
Because if you don't work on the inner work of yourself, even when you think you're going to help, you're still causing harm. There are a series of behaviors that are unconsciously in our bodies, right? Because trauma stays in our bodies, that we play out when we are in relationship to others, whether it's proximate relationship, horizontal relationship, whatever the relationship is. The ways in which we don't work on our unconscious biases, our unconscious relationship with microaggressions, it's going to show up in the ways in which we work and go help in communities of color. And then on the other end is when you're so focused on the external, it's are you doing this so that you can be in that notion of the good white person, right? Because the world exists specifically in supremacy and this good or bad binary. So are you trying to prove on the external that you're a good person, but you're still not doing the deep inner work that it's a lifelong journey to do? Like you can't just read a book and say, "Oh, I'm not racist, and now I'm going to go volunteer in the and get proxy. I'm going to move into the Black community, and I'm going to give all my money, and that's all I need to do." Absolutely not. There's definitely an internal work that's required where you have to look at your story, the ways in which you were socialized, so your family stories. You have to look and interrogate your relationships. You have to interrogate, why am I always over friendly to Black people when I see them in comparison to my white counterparts? There's a lot of inner unpacking. It's like peeling the layers of an onion. You think you're getting to the core, but you're not there yet. And I think a lot of folks think this is just some quick fix so that we can solve, um, we go break down the systems of domination, but it's not. It's like a real lifelong journey into actively becoming anti-racist.
Mm. Yeah, it did strike me. Every story, it felt like that you get that feeling of the peeling back the layers, and oh, I've done this work, but oh wait, there's more over here.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that did stand out because I think you're not. I don't think you're saying only do the inner work. I think I don't think I want to make sure you're not saying only do the inner work and that
Right,
external is bad,
right. No,
but
no, no,
it's
no.
yeah. You want to say
It's
more about
saying,
that?
yeah, yeah, it's saying do the inner work and there's a and the external work. So
Yep.
we now have
Yep.
this process where I say niche down the journey, right? Set goals with your journey and make sure self-care is a priority, because the reason why people stop their journeys of the inner work and the external work is they're burnt out overperforming the ways in which they should show up for racial justice.
Yeah, that's such a good. I wanted to make sure we made that point because I think you're making some really subtle and nuanced points in here, and I want to make sure the book really outlines that for the folks who haven't read it yet. And I recommend please go read it. I want to
Mhm.
make sure your nuanced arguments are, and points are getting out there. Um, so, as a moderator of an online women's or moms group, Heather cultivated an environment of friendliness and high vibes. deleting anything that might come across as rude or racist. And then finally, a conversation about race blew up that couldn't be ignored. Her close friend who is Black told her, "I don't feel safe in your group and never have," which I think surprised her. And by sweeping difficult conversations under the rug, she realized she was perpetuating white politeness, sidestepping conversations about race. And to lead the community, she had to learn how to confront hard questions with others and within herself. So I'm curious, what can leaders take away from Heather's story? Because as a moderator, she was a leader of a
Hmm.
community. People
Hmm.
looked at her as a role model, and it was her role to monitor those things and to take action.
Absolutely. I think as a leader, when that happens, you have to pause, because the first thing is defensiveness. The first thing is to
Mm,
get on guard. Well, I created the space and it's safe, and I don't know why you feel this way. And it's a sense of guilt that shows up that causes a adverse reaction. So the first thing when that happens, when someone points out they don't feel safe, is to pause and ask them to tell you more. Tell me more. Be curious, right? So engage in your leadership role from a space of curiosity and ask more
mm,
questions and reflect back what you hear, and then have the other individual, if it's a person of color, reflect back and then take that information and process it for yourself. And while you're processing, what I tell a lot of leaders is to use the Byron Katie's system of inquiry to really investigate, like, this person says this, it's true for them, this is their experience, and I'm going to lean into my discomfort and understand it's their experience. While I don't see it, while I don't understand it, I need to hear what they're saying, take it as like a serious point to go be an advocate for change in the workplace. Because
mm,
oftentimes we hear these stories, and the fragility, and this is me from just my own background in corporate and organizational settings, is okay, we'll fix it, and nothing ever happens. There's no
mm,
sense of resolve. And Black and brown women and men are always leaning into the tension of non-closure. However, if the instance was the opposite, where a white person went to a white leader and said, oh, I don't feel safe, there would be more measures taken to make
mm,
sure that the white person in the room felt safe, that there was a sense
mm,
of comfort and security. So the best thing I would say to a leader who has someone who comes to them and says, like, hey, I don't feel safe, this space is not for me, lean in with curiosity, ask questions, reflect back, and process what you can do to show up as a leader in the space to be a voice of change in social advocacy.
That's so good. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more too about white politeness and the role that maybe that plays in how leaders respond.
That's interesting. White politeness.
Well, that's what she said in her
Hmm.
story. So she said she realized she was perpetuating white politeness, which I think was I didn't know when she said that. I thought, oh, I've never heard that term before. I just wondered what I mean. Maybe you don't know what she means by that, but but
I
like
know
that
Chanel
idea.
what she means.
Okay,
Well, it's
okay.
it's da, 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 da. I just took a minute, like, Um, it's
Hmm.
this gnosis that values being nice and peaceful instead of engaging in hard conversations and dialogue around issues of race, or not even just issues of race, or just I'm a nice white person. I'm a good white person, because you rather lean into your niceness than really have the hard conversations, engage in the dialogue, or even do your anti-racism work. And we see it often. We see it portrayed on TV all the time. We see it portrayed in the media. Um, and it's just, what do we do about that? How do we move past, like, it's not about nice. It's not about this binary, because that fits in that good bad binary. You're either good or bad. There's no room to be in the middle. So you're either nice or you're mean, but there's no space to be a human. So how do you look past a binary of nice or mean, and really be human, and own up your mistakes, and don't worry about it being polite. Our society has us, specifically white folks, like overperforming niceness to soothe
Mm.
comfort for their own selves.
I think it's really an important message for leaders because hard conversations are so important. In my own background, I've worked in people ops and been a COO, and I've worked on that side a lot. One of the biggest things I see where things get really far far away from where we might want things to be is because they struggle having the hard conversations. And this is certainly a case where talking about race may not necessarily be comfortable, like you said. So I just
Yeah.
wanted to kind of get a little bit more about that, because that was another thing that really stood out to me, that I
Yeah, yeah,
think
yeah, yeah.
we don't, as a white person, I don't know that I'd realize, like, well, you're nice, like, you know what I mean, like, oh yeah, wait, that might be something that is impacting
Mm-hmm.
how I work on these issues and how I relate with myself and the world.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you. That was
You're welcome.
it was really good. All these stories, there was something out of every story. There's probably like three things I took out of every story, but I
Right.
tried to like set. I was like, okay, you got to narrow this down, because there's so many layers and depths to each story. So
Mm-hmm.
for people who have not read yet, absolutely, read the book. You'll get even more. There's a lot of nuance in there and lots of different, yeah, lots to ask about. Okay, let's talk about Jamie. So Jamie worked in social work in East Oakland with folks who were predominantly of other races. And she wanted to help, to have an impact, which I think a lot of people, a lot of leaders go into it. When I've surveyed leaders, they want to have an impact. So I think this is
Mm-hmm.
really relates to leaders. And she had this to say about her experience of working with youth. While I loved and supported them, I did not always truly listen, nor had I fully examined my identities and the worldview and privilege that they come with, to make sure that the advice I gave was well informed or even needed. And like I said, I think this relates to many leaders. And like Jamie, it can kind of be hard to see how their cultural background and worldview influences how they lead and interact with folks from other backgrounds. Where
Mm-hmm.
do you suggest leaders begin, in their journey around this?
There's really a lot of work they need to do on white culture and white identity,
Mm,
and really investigating what are the aspects of white culture that I know is true that might not be representative from someone of a different culture. So
mm,
there's several references, and the one reference I use is by Judith H. Katz, and it's called Aspects and Assumptions of White Culture in the United States. So the aspects and assumptions of white culture in Britain, in the UK, in Germany might be different than here in the
mm,
States, right? And some of those aspects are like this idea of the bootstrap theory. Like, I pulled myself up by the bootstraps and I paid for college. Well, you never know. Someone who works with you and in a department may not have had that same experience. And so that's an aspect and assumption that you might have, that, this idea, well, everyone has a choice to go to college. That is true. But you, as a white identified person, you don't have the same barriers as a black person would have
mm,
to obtaining a college degree, or the awareness of, let's use financial aid, for example. There are thousands of young black folks that go into college their first year and they just take out all these massive student loans, and they're failing their college. They're failing in college, taking out all their loans. And once they hit their cap, they might be like a sophomore in college. And then what do, right?
yep.
Um, so that was just an example. But if you think about the assumptions about your white identity and the aspects of that give you that level of privilege, folks in the workplace don't have that same experience. Another one
Mm,
is this notion of rugged individualism or time. We
mm,
often tell folks in our workshop that time is a social construct. So for you, while it might be inappropriate to be 5 minutes late to work every day, in some cultures, you don't know what the barrier is for someone to get to work on time, specifically if it's a person that holds a marginalized identity. You don't know what the barrier is. Your assumption is that they're maybe rooted in a stereotype. Well, they're just lazy and tired. They're always going to be late. You don't know if that's true. You don't know if it's a single mom or a single dad who
um,
has to drop a child off at childcare on public transportation to make it to work on time. So there's these variety levels of assumptions that we have that's tied to white identity. Um, and yeah, you have to
mm,
examine your own assumptions of your culture versus someone else's in order to be able to kind of just sit back and hold space for someone with a
mm,
different cultural identity.
Yeah, it's like this idea of like deep introspection and kind of peeling back my own identity and who am I and how did I get here and how are people different than who I am, and again, the idea of assumptions, because I think it's one thing to observe data and then like a lot of times we fill in a whole bunch of assumptions, and we think, oh, we're just
Mm-hmm.
observing data when in fact what we're doing is filling in this gap. right?
Yeah,
Instead of just observing it, which is why I love what you said too earlier about like ask questions and try to understand, look at yourself and then try to make sure you're not filling in assumptions.
absolutely.
Yeah, so good. Such a great, reminder. So we've got a question from the audience here. How can leaders in the workplace who hold power distribute some of that to and center and amplify marginalized employees?
Oh, that's a really great question. I think if you hold the
So
power and
good.
you want, it's so good. I love this question.
So good.
You
Thank
hold
you.
the power and you want to distribute the power. What is it in your role that
Mm,
you can give to a marginalized employee and center them in the work? Like, hey, I've taken more off I see the value in who you are, and I would love to give you this project, this role, and tell the team about it. So one, you talk to the employee about it. You give your power away. You inform the team, the department, the company head, whatever your top levels are, that this is what I'm doing and this is why. Not only do you offer them the position, but you coach them in the role. Because what happens often is that marginalized people are given this position of power, but there's no ongoing coaching and support so that they can level the skill set that you see in them. So you make the decision, you give away your power. What is it in my role that I can give away to someone who holds a marginalized identity? Who are the folks in power and leadership that I need to tell? How will I coach this person? How will I train my employees that this person holds this role and don't come to me because you're used to me holding this power, always diverting to the person that you gave the power to. Because what's also going to happen is as you're elevating that person who holds the marginalized identity,
mhm,
as you're coaching them, folks will still come to you because you used to hold that place of power without them recognizing the unconscious bias behind it. So then there might be a staff training that you also need to do to say, hey, this person holds this power. If you come to me and you ask me questions, I'm always going to divert you to them because I trust in their ability to lead in the space. And
mm,
that's it. That's all. I think you just do it and you have the coaching available. You tell the top ups, you tell the people on the team, and you always make sure that you check in and really have a really good place for that person who holds that identity to have safe space to share their concerns with you if they experience discrimination or bias in the workplace.
mm. Yeah, it's really interesting because it gets to a point that I think, as a leader, like really supporting them in multiple different ways. Again, seeing that their experience might be different and seeing, the idea of people going around them and making sure that that does not happen, that there's like a
Hmm.
consistency and that you are reinforcing them in their
Yes,
own power of position.
yes, absolutely.
Position,
Because that,
position of power.
absolutely. The power dynamics are always at play, so we always got to make sure that there's this notion of even if you do elevate the voice, is it shared power or is it still power over? What is the power position and behind why you want to do this?
Yeah, power dynamics are super important for leaders in general. And it
Hmm.
seems to me that when it comes to issues around wanting to be anti-racist, that they're even more important to
Oh,
recognize. You
absolutely.
can't just put somebody in this position. You need to really support and empower them fully
Mhm.
in
And
order
not
to
just
succeed.
that, like the one thing we do when we work with organizations is we talk about as you're elevating voices, like you have to change your community norms. What are your
Mm,
agreements for working in community together? You have to have a mediated and restorative justice approach to handle conflict resolution when harm is caused because of the unconscious awareness of microaggressions. So there's a whole process that we've kind of created to walk leaders through, like what this looks like to create something like this. We always defer to this idea of a restorative justice conflict mediation strategy to make sure that harm is resolved across racial difference in the workplace.
And and for those folks who don't know that term, what do you mean by restorative justice? Can you just tell us a little bit about what that is and what you
Right.
mean?
Right. So oftentimes when you think of the word restorative justice, you think of the ways that it's applied to the justice system in
Hmm.
response to a way a crime is handled between a victim and an offender, and sometimes with representatives of the wider community. The work of the restorative justice is rooted in the indigenous practice of restoring community, right? And we can see this when Martin Luther King talked about a beloved community. It's this idea where you bring in the two coworkers, we'll say in this instance,
Mm,
and you create space to where they can say what's on their mind, share, reflect back, and then reintegrate back into a sense of community. So it's a way to repair harm that's caused. There's no expectation of reconciliation, and folks will be friends and colleagues, but it's a way to restore the relationship in the workplace so that there's no kind of sides aren't taken, if that's helpful.
Mm.
So it's a community-based approach to restorative harm, not necessarily the way we see it applied to the criminal justice system. It's a very new practice. If you have children at home here in America, a lot of the schools are also using this restorative justice practice to mediate and restore harm in schools, but they're also using social and emotional learning, this is interesting. We were just talking yesterday about the idea that actually what's also needed in leadership spaces is a level of social emotional learning for adults and restorative justice approaches to conflict mediation.
Mm. It's so good. I wanted to make sure to get that because I think you're doing the work that you're doing is really nuanced and evolving some things, and
Yes.
I want to make sure that we draw that up because I think language and meaning, making sure we have a shared understanding of what we're talking
Yeah.
about can be so important.
Mm-hmm.
We've got another question here.
Okay.
Okay, when you go to a leader and tell them you're unsafe due to covert acts of racism and it's negatively affecting your ability to perform at work, and the leader can only think about the safety criteria on the organization's checklist, how can you get the leader to take this up without having to do all the emotional labor because you are tired?
Oh man. Whew. I, Let me tell you, I'm still tired because I'm still doing this. It's so then I
Mm,
had to basically for myself. There's a document called Aspects and Assumptions. No, it's the 10 tenets of white supremacy in the workplace. And I wrote a letter to my supervisor and I CC'd their supervisor. And you just, unfortunately, until you can find an advocate in
mm,
HR to support you, you actually continue to do emotional labor because they can't see it. So the only advice I have if you're experiencing harm is to you say it once to your supervisor, document everything in writing, go to their supervisor, make sure that you have everything documented, all of the times you've went to your supervisor. Go to HR. HR doesn't do anything. You have to show how the policies in the organization are upholding white supremacy. And you have to
mm,
identify that and outline that. That is the work that we do, the emotional
mhm,
labor that we do as people, as Black women, brown women in the workplace. It's
mm,
because one of the tenets of white supremacy in the workplace is if it's not in writing, the worship of written word. Okay, this is your organizational policies. This
mm,
is how this policy is reinforcing white supremacy. I don't feel safe. It is impacting my mental health. If you have been going to therapy, have your therapist also write a note because then you're
mm,
also tracking it for yourself. So I've learned this from my mother who's worked in a similar situation in education where you have to always document yourself to keep yourself safe. And then you have to have your medical records, and then you go to HR and you have a case now. They have to now sit back and look and listen like, hey, this person has documented information from a medical provider. This person has these dates detailed on the email of instances of asking for support. They've come to HR, they've written the CEO. Sometimes you have to go all the way to the top
mhm.
and fight.
Yeah.
And even the CEOs of top organizations don't see this as an issue. We are, even when we are suffering, even when we are already tired, we have to fight for ourselves because there's no one in the workplace fighting for us.
Mm.
And I'm
Yeah,
sorry because
that
that's probably not what you wanted to hear, but I'm still actually going through a similar fight myself.
mm, mm. Yeah, thank you. I love that question because I have well, tears in my eyes because it really shows the efforts that your brown and black employees, particularly black women and black men, face, and the levels of effort. And to me, it strikes me minimally as a leader when someone has documentation. I mean, minimally, like what I mean. It's something to really be looked at. And of course, it should not get to that place. To be frank.
Yeah. I would just tell anyone who's a person of color, you document everything. And if it's impacting as a mental health advocate,
No.
you talk to your therapist and your therapist will actually track with you. I have lots of notes from my therapist where she is tracked every instance.
Mm,
There was 6 months that all we talked about was work, and all she talked to me about was, and I'm self-disclosing for those of you who are watching, My mental health experience and me living through trauma and why I'm having adverse reactions because I'm not safe. I'm in constant, you are probably like me, I was in constant fight or flight. And so you document everything, you go to your supervisor, you go to their supervisor, HR, then you go to the top. It's emotionally laborious to be a black or brown person
Mm.
in a corporate space.
Mm. Yeah. Well, and it also strikes me too that, sometimes I think we lump people like, oh, you're a manager or you're a leader, and we think they all have equal amounts of power. And in fact, there are still hierarchies within leadership. You know what I mean? Role leader, there are still hierarchies within there. And it
Mm-hmm.
strikes me too that the person who wrote this or other people, that it could be as a manager or leader, as being, a brown or black leader, that you can still be experiencing these things as well.
Oh, yeah. When you're a brown or black leader, you're still experiencing it. And if you don't uphold the policies set by the organization, then you have to also ask yourself, am I willing to risk my job, my livelihood, to be an advocate for change in the workplace? There are so many layers to this conversation. So
Yeah. I apologize about that. My phone just took over my computer. I apologize about that.
it's okay.
Forgot to put my phone on airplane mode. Yeah, such rich questions. These have been incredible, and I'm curious. When you started to write this book, did anything surprise you, or when you started to do this work, was there anything that really surprised you?
The only thing that really surprised me during this whole process was um, I really recognized that I grew up anti-black. I grew up with a generation of
Mm,
color blindness where I didn't identify. I knew I was black. I did all the black. My mom did Kwanzaa. I was exposed to Black history, but
mm,
it was so ingrained in me that we were all one. That there's equity and justice for all, and you could pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Like I realized how much supremacy was embedded in me and my own anti-blackness. That it helped me it really, really helped my healing journey and really helped me recognize how to heal my way forward on my own journey.
mm. Yeah, thank you. It's interesting too how you can't even see how it sunk into you, maybe, and the layers that we have, that each of us have to peel back in order to really move forward on an anti-racist journey for everybody. That peeling back those layers is for all of us.
Yeah. Yep.
Mm. Thank you so much. This conversation was so interesting, and I learned so much. Um, Thank you everybody for joining the session. So our next session will be on November. Oh, no, it will not be on November 3rd. We're going to be on October 29th, I believe. We'll have some more details about that, where we'll be speaking with Seung Chan Lim on his book, Realizing Empathy. And on December 8th, we'll be talking to Edmund Lau on his book, The Effective Engineer. Thank you so much again, Myisha. We
You're
really
welcome.
appreciated having you here today.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Thanks,
All right.
everybody.